background, and for everyone who's now called in, we do a faculty development series, and this is our 6th or 7th one. Once a month, our faculty comes together and we pick different topics that are relevant to academic practice and professional growth. And so today, the topic was conflict resolution. And you're a kind of a controversial sort of guy who has generated conflict, but you've also resolved a lot of conflict. So we're really lucky to have you join us. Those of you who don't know Ron, you should be aware that he is an honorary Mount Sinai faculty.
I am.
Yes, with a long history, one of the very first Grand Round speakers we had at this program over 25 years ago. Ron is Senior Vice President now of the Brigham Mass General Health System. Is that correct?
I'm actually just the Chief Operating Officer of Mass General Brigham of the system. That's my whole title.
In my eyes, you're the Senior Vice President. But anyway, listen, it's great. But Ron's also Chair Emeritus of Emergency Medicine and founding chair of the program. In addition, he's senior editor or editor-in-chief of the Rosen's textbook. But more important, really, he's been a leader in emergency medicine since its beginning. He was my first attending at GW back in 1985, and he was generating controversy and conflict even at that time, because it's hard to imagine, but Ron actually wanted to paralyze patients to intubate them. And that was like just incredible, because if you paralyze someone, they don't breathe. And if they don't breathe, you might kill them. So people just thought this was impossible. But Ron kind of saw the future and has led us into the present time of advanced airway management. So listen, Ron, that's enough of an introduction, because I'm starting to blush for you. And
Great.
Thank you for joining us.
Thanks. I'm going to share my screen here and hope this works. And you should now be seeing a slideshow, are you?
Yes.
Wow, amazing. So I'll just tell you, Andy, that thank you for the introduction. It's always great to get together with you and your team there. And I see a few familiar faces on none of them are live. They're all just the photos, but I see Eric there and Scott and some others. And it's really interesting now in talking to residents about controversies like airway management, that they're not even aware of what the controversy is. So now it's Scott talking about whether we should, how we should precondition people and pre-oxygenate them. It's not about whether you would actually paralyze them. When I gave the first national talk on rapid sequence intubation in 1987 in San Francisco at ACEP, I was absolutely savaged by the audience. There were about 450 people in the room, and about 20 of them lined up with the microphones at the end. And I was absolutely savaged by the audience for these preposterous things, and that we shouldn't be giving neuromuscular blocking agents outside the operating room. They shouldn't be given by people other than anesthesiologists. And what was most interesting and distressing about that was that these were emergency physicians mostly who were saying this. So it was really interesting going through all of that and becoming a lightning rod for something that I thought was so straightforward that it didn't even warrant discussion. But I'm glad to hear that all of that has settled down. But as Eric Lagome, who I see has popped on there, will attest, I have created a significant amount of controversy through my career. And I will say that most of the time I did not create any of that controversy inadvertently. And I think one of the big plans that we all have to have as we go through our professional life is that if we are going to create conflict, it has to be deliberate. And the weight of that conflict, the price of it, has to be weighed against the opportunity it presents to move forward. So most of the time, of course, we accomplish things without conflict, but I'm delighted to talk to you about this. And Andy, just so you know, after I foolishly accepted this yesterday, I dug out an old conflict talk I had, and then I completely rewrote it because I realized it was much more written at a resident level, and it was written at a less experienced time in my career, probably about 5 or 6 years ago. So I'm at a different level of conflict now as we try to integrate this system and bring the departments of surgery at the Brigham and the General and get them working together on one thing. Eric, you remember those days. It was hard enough to get the surgeons to work with emergency medicine at MGH back in the 90s. And now we're getting people working together across the system. And it's been really interesting, and taking organizations that have been incredibly successful and trying to help them understand they have to change. It's really interesting work. So what I'm going to talk about today, though, is conflict resolution, or I'm going to rephrase it really as conflict prevention, because resolution always means something's happened, and it's much better to deal with how you prevent that. But I did characterize it here when I did my rewrite last night as one of the few constants in academic medicine. It's a constant in life too, but it's a real constant in academic medicine. So I want to just kind of walk you through this a little bit, because you can't avoid conflict. It will stalk you. And one of the reasons it stalks you, particularly in emergency medicine, is because a lot of what we need as a solution is creating a problem for someone else. We need fewer boarders in the ED. That creates a problem for the inpatient services. Likewise, they operate, we think, inefficiently. That creates a problem for us because we get the boarders. We need these behavioral mental health patients placed. Who's going to place them? The people we ask don't necessarily want to be doing that work, but end up doing it. So everything that we do has a kind of a push and a pull to it, and our pull is often someone else's push. The other problem that I think is relatively unique to medicine is the culture of anonymity that we've built. And this is particularly a house staff issue, but I would say it's an issue at every level. And the culture of anonymity is when someone answers the consult call by saying orthopedics, and the resident says, or the attending says, oh, hi, I've got a person down here with a such and such fracture or whatever. And they say, well, I don't need to see that. I can see that in clinic tomorrow or whatever. And you get in this conversation that you really shouldn't be in, because the patient definitely needs to be seen. And eventually conflict arises and something happens, and you kind of compel the person to come down and see the patient. It just doesn't end well. Or you say, oh, I'll call your attending then, blah, blah, blah. But I just found through all the years of doing this that getting the person to become unanonymous at the very beginning of the call changes that whole dynamic. So when they call and say orthopedics, and you say, oh, hi, this is Dr. Ron Walls. Who am I speaking with? Orthopedics. Great to have you as orthopedics. What's your name? And then they might say Thompson, and just say, is that your last name or your first name? That's my last name. And then you say, what's your first name? And there's a pause, and then they say, Cynthia. Oh, Cynthia Thompson, great to meet you. Let me remind you, I'm Ron Walls, and and then you start talking. And it's very different when somebody has been exposed like that by having to say their name. And even if they say their name the first time, as John Thompson Orthopedics, you say, I'm sorry, did you say your name is John Thompson? And make them repeat it. It gets them out from behind what they're hiding, where they're hiding. And one of the ways I think about that is, how do people treat you? Well, you would live in New York, so this may not be any different, but how do they treat you when they bump into you on the street versus when they drive by you in their car? And the anonymity of the car that allows them to honk and be rude and pressure and tailgate disappears a lot, at least when you get in a social setting, maybe not on the streets of Manhattan. But that culture of anonymity really contributes to a lot of the breakdown we have. Another one is that we don't set clear expectations. And the biggest thing is that we don't, in our own mind, know what we're trying to solve for. So to come back to that orthopedic issue again, if what we're trying to solve for really is that we just need the patient taken care of, then maybe what the person on the other end of the phone is proposing is perfectly rational, but it might not be what we thought we needed. So if what we were trying to solve for is, I'm going to get orthopedics to come and see this person at the bedside because that's what I told the patient, if that's what I'm trying to solve for, but the thing I should be trying to solve for is, I just need to get this patient taken care of in the right way, that can create a conflict right off the bat. And especially when my idea of the solution set and someone else's idea is different. And then there's the personal thing. It's really hard not to take things personally when they happen in the professional environment. Peter Rosen, a great mentor for all of us in many, many ways, he had an expression. And the expression was, get your lovin' at home. And what he meant by that was, you don't need to have personal relationships and friendships at work. It's a professional relationship. maintain it as a professional relationship. And then if someone says, why'd you order a CBC? It doesn't have to be a personal thing like, oh, why are you so stupid? It could be a, why did you get this test? And Peter was always counseling, separating that professional veneer that we need to have from the personal exposed sort of rawness that's underneath it. The other thing is that we tolerate a lot of misbehavior. And I think of this is my own term for it, but I call it the litter theory, which is that if you walk down a spotless hallway, for example, you're very unlikely to take a candy wrapper off a candy bar and drop it on the ground. Now, I might say that everyone on this call is unlikely to ever do that anyway, but I would say the threshold for doing it's very different if you're walking down an area, say an alley out behind the hospital that's full of litter. And the more that we allow people to conduct themselves in an unprofessional or conflicting way, conflict-inducing way, the more that becomes the normal behavior. So dealing with everyone in every single instance, it's that old question of, how often is it okay, or when is it okay to beat a child? And the answer is it's never okay to beat a child. Having that same standard for unprofessional conduct or disrespectful conduct in the workplace is equally important, because otherwise it just builds up like litter and people get used to it. And then the last thing, which I'll just come back to briefly at the end, is over-reliance on asynchronous communication. We do an awful lot of stuff through pagers and texts and emails that we should be doing in person or by telephone. It's just easier, you get rid of it that way, but it actually ends up creating more problems because of the inability to pick up nuance when you're asynchronous. So the way that you succeed in life in general, as those of you who know I'm a Canadian, is to just think like a Canadian. And in my world, a lot of things come back to hockey. So I would just say that life is like hockey, and the objective in hockey is to get the puck in the net. And it doesn't have to be a beautiful picture goal like this one that Sidney Crosby scored to win in overtime to have the Canadian gold medal in 2010, Vancouver, over a rival United States of America team that I do hope for in everything except when they're playing the Canadians, by the way. But anyway, it could be a beautiful goal like that, or it can be just like a scrum in front and the puck eventually gets in the goal. It doesn't matter, you still get the point. And the reason that that's important is that scoring the goal is not some kind of personal validation. It's just what you're trying to do. It's your objective that you're after. So keeping your eyes on the objective is really important in avoiding conflict. And I'll take it one step further. If the objective is to score, while you're trying to score, the guy on the other team, the person on the other team, they're trying to do a lot of things to you. And some of those things are kind of legal and some are illegal. And they're all intended to keep you from scoring, but they're equally intended to keep you from thinking about scoring. If you have to start thinking about the fact that you're going to get clobbered, you might not think, gee, my primary objective here is to score. My primary objective might be just to defend myself. But the reason that that's so important is that if someone distracts you on your way to achieving your objective and you deal with the distraction, you're virtually guaranteed not to achieve your objective.
Uber XL.
Sorry, this is what happens when we're dealing with people who are disruptive or uncooperative or unprofessional on a telephone or in person, is we start getting into that. And we don't actually remember that the whole purpose of this was to get this patient consulted or off to the cath lab or get their echo or whatever. So the last thing about thinking like a Canadian is the old joke, why did the Canadian chicken cross the road? And the answer is to get to the middle. And Canadians are natural conciliators. So I'll talk about how much more important it is to prevent conflict than to mitigate it. So this comes back to the preventing conflict or avoiding it rather than dealing with it afterward. So one way to prevent it is to begin with success in mind. What are you actually trying to achieve? You're not trying to start a fight. You're not trying to win a fight. You're just trying to get a patient taken care of or a boarder dealt with or a colleague to change their position on the authorship order on a paper or someone to share their data with you who's decided they just don't want to share it. It's all of those things that we deal with all the time. What is the actual goal? What are you trying to achieve? Break the culture of anonymity. I mentioned that earlier and gave an example of that, but there's also a group association issue. If you can reassign the group, the person will work better with you. So for example, let's say that all of us right now on this Zoom, we're all doctors. So we're all part of that group. And we feel the identity of that group. And when you become a member of a group and you understand you're a member of a group, you embrace the culture of that group. But the flip side of that is that you automatically devalue the culture of all other groups. It's just the way we are. We're all like that. So when somebody calls you and the group that they're in is, say, I don't want to keep picking on orthopedics, so I'll say neurosurgery. If the group that they're in is neurosurgery and the group that you're in is emergency medicine, then you've got a problem. And getting them into the same group as you is really important. So getting a trainee to recognize they're really dealing with another trainee and it doesn't matter what the specialty is, or getting somebody who's a specialist in emergency medicine and a specialist in neurosurgery talking the same language because they're both doctors taking care of a patient. Getting them into the group you're in or getting into the group they're in avoids a lot of that devaluation of another group because there is no other group. Set a high threshold for what you perceive as a threat and don't escalate the tension. We see this all the time with everybody, with doctors and nurses, with house staff, even with patients, where you see someone go in to see a patient, they're late in a shift, feeling a little harassed, haven't eaten, have tried to eat for the last 4 hours, have thought seriously about it and even gotten toward the door of the ED a couple of times just to grab a granola bar out in the hallway. And every time they've failed to get out the door. So they're very frustrated, they're tired, they're set upon, they're behind, the patients are overwhelming, and they walk in a room and the first thing the patient says, well, you took your sweet time. I've been here for an hour and 45 minutes. That's your natural response is, well, what do you think I was doing? Drinking coffee out there? Don't you have eyes? Can't you see how I'm running around? And of course, as soon as you do that, you're in a conflict. And what actually feels better is if you can take that upset patient, and you all know this, I know this is obvious, but take that upset patient and get them on your side by recognizing that it is not fair that they had to wait as long as they waited. It doesn't matter why. It's not your fault either, but it's just not fair. And acknowledging that it's not fair and that you feel bad about it. You feel bad about yourself, but you also feel bad for that patient. If you were that patient, you'd want somebody to feel bad that you had to wait an hour and a half and you wouldn't really care why. They come to a world-class hospital, they expect world-class care and they don't get it. They're disappointed, they're hurt, they're scared, they're angry, all those things. So you fix it instead of escalating it. And I've done this both ways during my career. I gave a few lectures when I was young and impetuous, helped people understand just how important emergency physicians were and how busy we were. And 100% of the time that ends in abject disappointment. It just never gets you anywhere. So the other thing is to carry a basic set of assumptions about your colleagues. And I can come back to that in a second, but we have this, it's part of this identity thing of who we are and who someone else is, that somehow we're the hardworking, striving to do everything for the patient, and the other person is lazy or dishonest or something. And it's just almost never true. There are some people who aren't quite up to the standard we would like, but there aren't very many of them, and there certainly aren't in places like Sinai. So your colleagues, they're just like you. They're hardworking, honest, ethical, all those things that are on that list. They're probably stressed at times, maybe all the time. They feel mistreated. So I put it in quotes because they're not necessarily actually mistreated. They feel mistreated though. And they want what you want. They want things to work well. They just have a different definition of work well. Their definition is work well for them. Your definition is work well for you. The common ground is work well for the patient, or if you're working on a paper or something, work well for the project, work well for the department, work well for the hospital. And that's where you have to get them onto that common ground. So I drew this a long time ago. It's really hokey, but I actually like the animation I did on it. So I'm going to show it to you anyway. So this is the idea of an event initiation, meaning something has started. Maybe it was the patient saying, what the hell, I've been waiting for so long. And there's the pathway with all those desired behaviors that lead to the desired outcome. But there's the other pathway, which is that you can't reconcile the issue. And because of that, you lose sight of the goal and you stop trying to score by putting the puck in the net and you start trying to deal with the person who's hooking you or elbowing you as you're on your way there. And that gets into all this other kind of behavior. And look, we see this every day, right? First, there's passion. I'm advocating for the patient. And then there's indignation. Why don't you understand what we're trying, and it just goes on. And eventually you can win, but it really is that you won. You didn't succeed, you won. And to win, you paid a price. And that price is long lasting. And for you and that other person on the other side of that discussion, that price may always exist between you. That cost of transaction might never go away. So I just want to show you this from my cool graphics, but there's maybe some value in it. And the last thing I'll say before I start winding up, because I know we only have till 4:30. And I've used this a lot. I've had a lot of people I've worked with over the years who've gone on to become chairs. And I always tell them two things when they go to be a chair. The first is, are you really ready? Are you really at the position in your life or your career where you are going to be 100% focused on how other people succeed or achieve, and not 100% focused on
nobody was sure people were going to go back to the movies.
Hey, Ryan, could you mute for us? Thank you. So you have to be focused on other people's success, not on your own. That's the transition from being a rising person that trying to work your way up to be in a chair. And there are lots of other analogs to that as well. But the other thing is, when you're put in a position of authority, like a chair or a chief operating officer or a CMO or whatever, it's like having one weapon. You have just one weapon. So I used to use gun and bullet for this, but I don't like guns, so I changed it. But you have one arrow. Everybody knows you have that arrow, and everybody knows you could use it on them. Nobody's ever seen you use it, but they know you have it. They don't want it to be them. And there's this implicit authority that comes with that until you use that arrow. And the moment you say, it has to be this way because I'm the chair and I'm telling you it has to be this way, or I'm the attending, or I'm the whatever, that arrow's gone along with your credibility. And there's no way really to get it back again. And it's not just with that person. It spreads like wildfire. Ron Walls had one arrow and he shot it yesterday and it's gone. And everybody knows that. And it's disabling. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about email, and then I come back and summarize. So probably when I was a chair, probably 80% of the stuff I dealt with happened over email, the bad stuff. And the other 20% was interpersonal, in person. Email is, well, you can read it yourself. It's 10 times worse than a hard copy, 100 times worse than the telephone, and 1,000 times worse than being face-to-face. And it really gets you in trouble. And the more CCs and the more people you share your vitriolic opinion with, the more problem you get into. And I've dealt with chief residents and faculty and even other chairs who have done things often late at night that are really, really hard to undo once you hit send. So I have 5 rules for a successful career. Number 1, be careful whenever an email is longer than 3 sentences. Assume everybody's going to read it, including people who don't like you. And if you're feeling energy, and that's my pet word for anxiety, anger, stress, distress, hostility, sadness, whatever it is you're feeling, if you're feeling energy while you're writing an email, it's the wrong kind of email to send. So have a relationship with somebody and just send it to them and say, I was going to send this to Tom and Bill. What do you think? And 100% of the time, they're going to come back into your office and say, are you out of your mind? You can't send that email to anyone. And then you'll feel good that you sent it to them instead. So the second thing is, get the real facts before you judge or act. One of the things that happens with emails, people clean their inbox out and they just express opinions and they don't actually know what's going on. So if you really want to be judged fairly, you have to judge others fairly. And if you make an assumption when you read or understand, learn about something that somebody did something wrong to make it happen, then you have to be willing to understand that everybody's going to think you're doing something wrong too. And since you never do anything wrong, that can't be fair. So just make sure before you make a judgment on somebody who apparently did A, B, and C, that all you're really trying to do is find out what happened. You're not trying to judge them in the process. Meet in person. Right? So you say, never email when you can call, and never call when you can meet, never meet when you should just dismiss the whole issue to start with. But the more often you get together with your colleagues, really hard right now with Zoom and everything, and avoid email, the better. Social media is another whole world in social media. I'll just leave that. And remember the Larry David rule. So those of you who watch Curb Your Enthusiasm, I'm a big fan of Curb Your Enthusiasm. And, you know, he just can't help but speak up. And I found myself doing some of the same behaviors. So I created in my head what I call the Larry David rule, which is when somebody does something to you that you deem in some way offensive or intrusive, and you feel like you're going to deal with it right at the moment, there are only 3 reasons why you should do that. The first is it should correct an immediate wrong. So somebody's butting in line in front of a kid and the kid's getting knocked over. Yes, you're going to intervene there and you're going to correct an immediate wrong. There's no other time you can do it. It has to be right then. The second is that you will avoid that person engaging or eliminate the idea that person would engage in a similarly offensive behavior in the future. In other words, if I point out to that person that they butted ahead of me in line, they'll be apologetic and they'll never do it again. Well, that's pretty unlikely to be the case. And then the third is it'll make you feel better. And when you talk about it'll make you feel better, it has to be over a period of time. It can't be at the moment the words come out of your mouth, because you always feel good when you do that until about 30 seconds later, and then 3 hours later and 6 hours later. So if it's not going to correct an immediate wrong, it's not going to modify someone's behavior in the future and avoid future wrongs, and it's not going to make you feel better, then shut up. And so most of the time, of course, you're going to shut up because none of those 3 conditions will be met. So summary to wrap this up, I think I actually might get through it on time, is that to get through life, you got to think like a Canadian. So decide what the goal is and whether you must really win on any given point along the way, or if you really just want to get the goal. The goal is to get the patient seen, get the patient seen. Who cares if you won point number 1, point number 2, or point number 3 along the way? And again, breaking down that culture of anonymity, I think, really helps. See your colleague as yourself. Your colleague is just like you. They're tired, they're overworked, they're underpaid. They had a terrible chair for many years, as I know you all did when Andy was the chair, and finally we got that condition rectified. I'm only saying that because he always does that stuff to me. But your colleagues are just like you are. They're tired and they're trying to do their best. They're smart. They've always been the A students. They've always been the high achievers. That's what they want to be. That's how they see themselves. That's how you need to see them too. Don't compromise on professionalism, and that means yours or theirs, and respect. You can compromise on pretty well anything, but you can never accept a disrespectful treatment, and you can never indulge in it. And that was the old days. Those of you, Andy and Eric and some others who were around, that was the culture of the day. The things you had to get through in your day in emergency medicine in the early days was just trying to get people to not be just flagrantly disrespectful and dismissive of you and everything you believed in for patients, and even the whole specialty that wasn't a real specialty, and all the other things that we heard. Do require accountability. It's one of the reasons you get people's names. They're accountable for their actions. So I don't need to see that patient. I'll see them in the clinic. No, this fracture is actually really bad. You do need to see the patient here. Well, I don't think so. Well, I'm here seeing them, and I'm telling you, you really do need to see them. Well, I just disagree. Okay, I understand. Could you tell me your name again, please? Was it Joseph Fisher? Why are you asking? Well, I have to document in the record that I asked you to see the patient and that you refused, and it's better to identify you by name if that's the case. Well, I'm not refusing to see the patient. Oh, well, I thought you were. Well, great. When are you going to see them? And you just go through that whole sequence, but it's the accountability, the fact that people are accountable for their actions. And that is often why they hide behind the anonymous factor that they have when they lock themselves inside their car of their specialty or whatever. And then the last is do not assert authority as authority, because explicit authority has no durability. It comes back to that one arrow in the quiver thing. If you don't manage yourself to be able to get people to do what you need them to do by partnering with them in some way, and you have to compel them to do it, you're really playing your last card. You can't go back to the deck for more after that, to wildly mixed metaphors. So I think that's all I had, and I think we have -1 minute for discussion. So I'm sorry to have gone on too long.
No, that was absolutely great, and actually it tees up a discussion, and it also opens up the opportunity for anyone who's on the call. If you want to ask Ron his opinion or insights, or how he solved some problems that have been conflict for you. This is a great opportunity because he has so much cumulative knowledge. It's very interesting. I thought only Sinai had a problem with people introducing themselves on the phone. And it's something that just makes me crazy. So I wrote an email to all our chairs and residency directors of all the other departments. And I asked them if they would consider teaching their fellows and residents how to properly answer a call by beginning to tell their name and then end with saying, how can I help you? And it was amazing to me that most of the chairs wrote back and said, wow, that's such a good idea. As if, you know, as if I had said something so novel, and yet fast forward a couple of years, I cannot get consultants to answer the phone with their name. And it really does help to ask them, what is your name? My name's Andy Jagoda, and thank you so much for calling to help. What's your name? And it's just a lot of times breaks through some of the barriers that ultimately lead to conflict. So anyway.
Well, you know, but Andy, you know, we do it too. So we get the call back to our phone if that's what we're paged to, and we say things like, you know, ED.
I don't.
Right. Well, I'm not saying you and I do it necessarily. I don't do it at all anymore. I'm not in the ED anymore. But it's not unilateral. It's often bilateral. And you know, part of the objective of meeting a patient and caring for a patient who's not our patient, because we have the privilege of taking care of them in the ED, but they're not our patient, they're someone else's patient, is making sure that patient really understands who you are, so that you have your name is in their head, and they can, you know, a real goal of a visit, if somebody can stop you in the doorway on the way out, or just say, oh, Dr. Jagoda, I have one more question, and they're not reading your name off your name tag. They've actually come to accept it. You're their doctor, and they want to know your name, and they need to know it because it's important to them. These little things that we do have such an effect.
Yeah.
I think Scott has a question, or maybe a number of people do. I don't know, Andy, if you're moderating this or.
No,
I'd love to.
They can take themselves off mute and ask you questions directly.
All right, Ron, fantastic. Thank you for that presentation. For me personally, I'd always rather people just confront me directly whenever there's confrontation, but I found most people in medicine, that's not the case. And I'm usually disappointed, and it leads to far more trouble when I confront people directly, as opposed to passive aggressively by just writing to their superior and saying, we had this issue. Could you speak to that a little bit? I think somehow your personality may be akin to mine and how you've dealt with that.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. But I just wouldn't use the word confront. I think there's an assertion about that you don't necessarily want to be making. But I do agree with you. If you and I have an interaction and I don't like the way you behaved, and I don't say anything to you about it, I don't think I have the right to say anything to anyone else. It's not their business unless you and I couldn't resolve it. And it's really important for chairs too, for Andy in his role when he was chair, to think about somebody comes to him and says this and this and this happened, and they say, you know, with Rachel, I'm just looking at the center of the screen here, there's a Rachel there, with Rachel, and Andy should say, so I know he would, what happened when you talked to Rachel about it? And half the time, at least when you're a chair, the person says, well, I haven't talked to you about it. I wanted to talk to you about it first. I say, well, you got the wrong order. Because if you talk to Rachel about it, you probably don't need to be talking to me about it. And I don't actually really want to know about it if you can talk to Rachel about it. So I agree with you. I think if you have an issue with care too, somebody thinks, oh, somebody saw a case of appendicitis and missed it. Oh, that dumb PCP, they saw this person twice, didn't know they had appendicitis. That the only person you should be saying that to is that PCP, and not that way either. So I 100% agree with you, Scott.
That's great to hear.
So Ron, let me ask you a question. When you were chair, would you sometimes have conflict with your faculty? And what kind of issues created conflict between you as chair and your faculty?
Yes, of course, had conflict with faculty. Almost always it was money, time, or the schedule.
No, really?
Yeah, and I'll just tell you one story that is illustrative, I think, in a way. And by the way, in any of those interactions, if there were 100 interactions and at least 50 of them, I was at fault. So I'm not implying that I am some perfect to wise sage leader and the faculty always messes up or they're selfish or they don't get it or whatever. But I had a faculty member come in one morning and had the schedule in her hand, and I knew what the discussion was going to be because I could see the highlights on the schedule. And she was pretty worked up. And so I met her, and it's a faculty member I really liked, and she was a really good person. And she said, I want to talk to you about the schedule. And I said, are you sure you want to talk to me about the schedule? Because I don't make the schedule. I said, yeah, I know so-and-so makes it, but I don't want to talk to them. I want to talk to you. And I said, I don't think you want to talk to me about the schedule. She said, oh, yes, I want to talk to you about the schedule. So I said, okay. So I sat down and I said, tell me what you want to talk about. And she took out the month of October, whatever month it was, and showed me how many shifts she had and how many of them were weekend shifts or something, and said it was excessive. And that she had taken a couple of weeks off and she didn't think she should have to pay such a huge penalty to come back to work after a couple of weeks off. And I said, well, you didn't bring me the schedule though. And she said, yes, it's right here. And I said, but that's October. I said, the schedule started in January. So we should look at January to October. And the reason I said that, of course, was because for the last 3 years, I had funded 50% of her time entirely out of departmental funds for her to work in a lab with someone to advance her own research career toward what ultimately became for her a K, and then she went on to an R. But she'd completely forgotten that what it means when you fund somebody 50% of their clinical time with department funds, it means that the collective colleagues, I'm looking at you all right now, you all picked up shifts. That was part of your job, to cover those shifts that she didn't work during all of that time. So I wasn't upset with her or angry with her, but I did try to get her to think about more than 1 month, about being a part of a community for a longer period of time. And it didn't play very well for her. She thought I was, I think, being condescending, and she was too upset, and it just didn't connect. But she did come back to me about an hour and a half later, and in a completely different mood, and just say, that was really important what you said to me. I couldn't see it because I was so pissed off, but you're absolutely right. And I should never have had this discussion. And I'm just grateful actually that I had it with you and didn't have it with so-and-so who does the schedule, because it would have been embarrassing for me. And so that kind of stuff happens all the time. Chairs create conflict and chairs resolve conflict. But I really think the important thing is just to keep in mind what you're actually trying to solve for. And in that case, she was trying to solve for October. And from my perspective, I was trying to solve for the whole faculty and the whole year.
Ron, a quick question for you. Good to see you. Your talk was right on. I agree with so much of that. I think we all, including myself, have gotten so irritated when you walk in a room and someone says, I've been here for 35 minutes. How come you have ignored me? And it is hard, but you just gotta not react. I'd be interested in how you deal with at your position now, where you have to separate all the knowledge you've had in your career from emergency medicine to help make decisions that in some way probably adversely affect the emergency department, whether it's boarding, et cetera. And in some ways that they're clearly suffering down there, or it clearly helped them, but in your role for the entire institution, you can't necessarily take that into account. How do you find that happens a lot? And is it hard to separate that out of your entire career of what you've learned?
Well, I could talk to you generically about it. Hold on 1 second. Let me just tell my 4:30 that I'll be out there in a moment.
Oh,
That's okay. I'm having fun. So 5 minutes. So first, I actually get emergency medicine. I have a belief system around emergency medicine. I actually understand it, and that distinguishes me from a lot of people who are in my position, I think. I don't believe that patients should be subjected to undignified treatment because of where they're located in the hospital. I don't believe that providers should have to have patients in the hallway in one part of the hospital when they don't in any other part of the hospital. So I actually think emergency departments are starting so far behind in general that they don't need to really have anything taken away from them. It's already all been taken. So when I became COO at the Brigham in 2014, the first thing I did was double the size of the ED. So we spent $60 million going from a 28,000 square foot ED that you remember, Eric, to a 56,000 square foot ED that actually has privacy space for patients and proper space for providers and gets people out of the hallways and proper sized trauma rooms and all the things we needed. So I don't accept the fact that having patients in squalor is part of emergency medicine, and it's just the way it is. So that part was easy, but I will say in general, the things that you're talking about where you might have a particular perspective when you're working clinically and a very different perspective when you're working administratively, those things are difficult and they're hard to reconcile, particularly when they're resource asks. So let's say it's not about space, it's some other resource ask that you just can't meet. You do have to deal with that. But I think that the defining thing that ties us together and gets us in the same group on those discussions is the patient. Right? If we're both thinking about the patient the right way, or if it's about a faculty member or faculty development, if we're both thinking about the faculty or the faculty member the same way, then we can solve the problem together. It's when we can't find that common ground of, what is the core principle? What are we trying to solve for together? If we can't find that, then we're going to have conflict. But most of the time that is there to be found. And if people will, as again, get past the elbowing and hooking and all that and just we're just trying to get the puck in the net here and stay focused on that, it's a little easier.
All right, listen, Ron, thank you for giving us so much time, and we'll let you get to your 4:30. All right, we get the message, you gotta go. But
I gotta go.
Great.
No, sorry.
The only thing I'd like to say is I do agree your divergent pathways animation is a little hokey, but it did work, and we thank you for sharing it with us. That was great, really. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I've been at Sinai a few times and been at one of your faculty retreats, I know, as well. And I think this is one of the great programs in the country. I feel very honored to be an honorary member of the faculty here. It's something I'll cherish for the rest of my career. And I really appreciate the great things you're doing out there, and especially appreciate that you gave us your CFO, Niyam Gandhi, who I was actually meeting with just before I came in here. So
don't go there. Actually, that was so inappropriate, but we'll change the subject.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Keep up the great work.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
Bye-bye.